get us booted off. So anyway, hopefully my admission of guilt there won't do the same thing.
Uh, yeah, we'll talk about that again because that's actually something that came out yesterday in relation to some musical performances as part of an artwork by Tom Smith called Top 10. Um, Fantastic. It seems like we're live on YouTube now. So I'm gonna start official proceedings. So yeah, I'm James Parker. I'm an academic at Melbourne Law School and associate curator with Liquid Architecture, and this is lessons in how not to be heard. With the with the not pretentiously in brackets, because that's partly the question. It's the second of 3 live sessions that accompany a resource we've been developing and just launched with Unsound. It's called Machine Listening, a Curriculum, and we'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Just in general, and for those of you who weren't there yesterday. But first, we wanted to kick off by acknowledging country. I'm currently speaking from Sydney on the traditional lands of the Bidjigal people that to which sovereignty was never ceded, and I want to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, both from the Bidjigal people and other Indigenous groups in Australia and elsewhere. Joel?
No, go on.
Oh yeah. No, I was just and just also to situate machine listening as a problem, as a politics in relation to a conversation about place, a place in data colonialism, big tech imperialism as kind of continuing prior and continuing logics of imperialism. They're also related to ideas of placelessness, terra nullius, the kind of scientific objectivity that can kind of traverse the world, missing and not listening to or attending to place. So yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to say hello in the chat, say where they're tuning in from, Indigenous lands or otherwise, that would be great. We had a really diverse audience yesterday, and it'd be really good to see where you're all tuning in from.
And hi, everyone. My name is Joel Stern. I'm curator at Liquid Architecture. Super honoured to have been invited to present this program with Unsound. Very psyched about how it all went last night and feeling good about this second session. Of course, we're here on YouTube. I can see on Zoom, I can see about 165 people or so with us, which is fantastic. And this program is streaming on YouTube and on Facebook. I'm beaming in from the northern suburbs of Melbourne, which is the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. It's always has been and always will be Aboriginal land over which sovereignty has never been ceded. So I also want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to First Nations people who are listening, watching, and with us here tonight. And yeah, as James said, great if you can say hello in the chat and let us know where you are. So we're going to do a bit of work now to introduce not only this session, but the program altogether. And, we sort of raced through it a little bit last night, and apologies if it's a bit repetitive for those of you who were here last night, but we know many of you are here for the first time. So we thought we'd just say something about why machine listening, what is machine listening, and sort of why we've decided to approach the topic in this way.
Yeah, that was the reason for starting with that kind of montage of ads and but not just ads, to give a bit of a flavor of the breadth of what machine listening encompasses. I think people are kind of familiar with smartphones, obviously the Snowden revelation, smart speakers, and the sort of the listening that they do, the voice assistants and so on. But as I think that kind of that montage of ads showed, that there's many more applications for machine listening, and they're growing fast. Machine listening being the kind of the application of AI, deep learning techniques, and so on to audio. And actually, machine listening is a term that's kind of used in the scientific literature. They also use a whole range of other words like phrases like audio event detection, audio scene analysis, obviously automatic speech recognition as well. But part of the thing is that this is a field that hasn't finished developing yet, and it's not settled at all. So by naming, we sort of naming the problem machine listening partly because it seems something that you can kind of grasp onto. It has continuities with machine learning, machine vision, and there's already political traction with those terms, but also because the term comes out of has a history in music, and especially avant-garde music.
And
Joel,
I mean,
that was a
yeah, of
handover to you,
course.
Joel.
No, thank you. I mean, and of course, we're here at Unsound Festival, which is, a crucial place for people to come together and listen to experimental music, electronic music, and produce it, make it, and share it. And the organisation that I work with, Liquid Architecture, similarly is grounded in the history of experimental music and sound art. And these are fields in which people have a great deal of listening expertise. They're fields in which listening has been a discourse, a kind of a practice, and has evolved through incredible artistic innovation and provocation. And it's also a field in which there's a high sort of technological literacy. So we think in this sort of context of experimental music, we know a lot about machines, we know a lot about listening, but when we put them together with this formulation, machine listening, we have a lot to learn, and we want to do that learning collaboratively in public via this structure of a curriculum.
Yeah, so I might I hope I don't know if people have spent any time with the curriculum, but really, these live sessions we've been imagining as kind of attached to, or kind of the live element of a curriculum that we've been developing. I mean, I won't like walk you through it all, but like a traditional curriculum, or syllabus in a educational context, like it's got topic headings, and we've embedded audio and stuff, but there's exercise experiments that you can do, and these are some of these we've authored, some of them come from artists and other thinkers and so on. Anyway, I won't dwell on that, just to say that,
well, maybe James, just to make it explicit, I mean, the topic headings, if you have a look at them there on the right, each correspond with the sessions here at Unsound. And so if you want to sort of go deeper into, let's say, the conceptual framework for the session yesterday, or the one that we're in now, which is lessons in how not to be heard, if you click on that, James, you see that we've tried to kind of set up the conversation in a few different ways. And obviously the reference for some of you who will have got it straight away to Hito Stahle's How Not to Be Seen, a fucking didactic educational .mov file from 2013. So the work by Stahle, which is presented as a series of lessons, as kind of tactical, strategic, but also poetic, satirical in places, highly experimental. That was the framework that really, in some ways, triggered some of the thinking behind this session, flipping seen, of course, to heard. And then, as James mentioned, rather pretentiously bracketing the not, because, as we developed this session, we started to realize that one way of thinking about it is the lessons in how not to be heard, and another way of thinking about it is to pose it as a question: how not to be heard, or how to be heard, with the not also as a question. So I think the way we've structured this intro is a rather playful sort of series of suggestions, provocations, tactics that fall under different lesson headings. And one of the things we wanted to invite you to do, the audience who's out there listening on Zoom or YouTube or Facebook or wherever, is help us add to these lessons, to the texts that follow underneath the lessons, the tactics, the strategies, the proposals. Give us some tactics on how to be heard or how not to be heard, and we'll add them to the list.
Yeah, and ranging from, the technical or the tactical to to the structural, right? It's not just a matter of like, you know, putting in some noise masking or something, right? But like, how do we take on the structures of power and and so on that are listening to us, or changing the meaning of listening itself. So yeah, that's a bit of the context. In a way, like you might think of each one of the presenters this evening or today as presenting a kind of a lesson or a provocation or a question about what it would mean to be heard or to not be heard, or how precisely to be heard by listening machines or machines that purport to listen. And so we've got a really great, or we think a great lineup of participants. We're extremely grateful to them. We're not going to do lengthy introductions now, but just to say we have Halcyon Lawrence. I mean, maybe the presenters who are here would like to turn on their microphones, just briefly give people a wave. I mean, their cameras. You don't have to. Halcyon Lawrence. We got Joel Spring, who's done work with Jazz Money. We've got Carolina Ivanska. There's a work by Lawrence Abu Hamdan, Alex Ahmed, Matt Dryhurst, and DeForest Brown Jr. So we're going to.
We should also give a strong shout out to our co-curator Sean Dockeray, who's made an enormous contribution to this program, and is really the person most responsible in some ways for the curriculum format and the kind of radical pedagogical direction and structure that this program has taken. So Sean's there too, waving to everyone. And there's so thank you, and you'll be seeing most of those faces again over the next couple of hours as we introduce and feature the artists and their work. I'll just mention there's a few different ways to engage. Unsound have done a really amazing job at trying to produce a kind of festival atmosphere in this sort of socially distanced reality. Of course, there's the chat window here in Zoom, and we're really excited to see people putting comments in and just offering feedback and sharing ideas there. We do have the Q&A available. We won't be dealing with questions in the Zoom itself, but you're really welcome to pose them, and we'll certainly look at those questions and think about them, and we'll be heading over to the Discord chat space that Unsound have set up, and happy to continue conversations there as well. And I think that's all the platforms.
We can get on with it. I mean, we should say some thank yous. Thanks to everyone at Unsound again. Really appreciate all the work you put in for this, Matt, Gossia, everybody else, and also at LA Liquid Architecture. There's a load of people working behind the scenes. The producer for tonight is Lauren Squire, who's done an amazing job. Also, Debris Facility, who produced the images behind Joel and I here, and Georgia, Elisa, who's in the chat right now, and a bunch of others.
Shall we introduce Halcyon Lawrence then? Would you like to do that?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I just invited you to. I can do it. No. We both can. We were super excited to have Halcyon here to give a kind of lecture performance. Hi, Halcyon. Very nice to see you. It's very early in the morning where you are, so I'm super appreciative. And Halcyon's an assistant professor at Towson University. Her work deals with speech intelligibility, the design of speech interactions. She's done work on Siri and Alexa and voice user interfaces, and it's really critical and vital and amazing and quite entertaining work. And we're absolutely thrilled to have you here. So if you'd like to...
Can I just say one thing before Halcyon kicks off? Just that we had a great conversation with Halcyon a few weeks back. It's part of an interview series that we put together for the project. There's 14 interviews, I think, up now. We're going to do more. And just like, we've given all of the presenters very small windows because we're kind of going for a kind of a montage.
Small Zoom windows.
Yeah, that's right. Like as many lessons as possible rather, than the depth. And so if you do want to listen to Halcyon talk at length about her work, you should head there. I just put the link in the chat window there. But I think that's it for now, Halcyon. Over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. To be heard or not to be heard. Growing up in the Caribbean on my island of Trinidad and Tobago, I did not think about accent in the same way that I do now. I was aware that I spoke differently. Speaking the Queen's English is still an expectation of an educated citizen, even nearly after 60 years of independence. Like most, I grew up bi-dialectical, switching between the not so mother tongue of England and our distinctive Creole, influenced by English and French and Spanish and Hindi and other languages. I remember my first volunteer experience when I taught in an inner city school in Port of Spain. I was speaking what we colloquially call proper English, and within seconds of uttering my first words, the 11-year-old students broke into giggles. When I asked what was wrong, they said, "You speak funny." It was just what I needed, permission to relax and talk in my Trini twang. I have always been aware that I have an accent, but that never meant that I had difficulty being heard. In 2008, I moved to the US to pursue my graduate studies. I lived in Chicago for nearly 6 years on the South Side, where my Black skin allowed me to move undetected as a foreigner until I opened my mouth to speak. And there began a barrage of questions and comments about my accent. "Where are you from originally? I love your accent," strangers would say. And to my shame, and perhaps my survival, I used my accent to negotiate the culture of anti-Blackness I witnessed daily in America. I can recount being followed around in a convenience store, being surveilled from afar. But once I opened my mouth to speak, I was greeted with, "Oh, you're from England." No, I would think. But if that's what you need to believe so that I can leave here safely, then yes, I'm from England. It was there in Chicago I discovered the American fetish for the British accent, often equated with class and intelligence. This was also the first time in my life that I understood that accent was a mark of identity and a tool I could use on my terms to navigate unwelcoming anti-Black spaces. Still, I never had the difficulty of being heard. In a respectful exchange, there's a beautiful kind of linguistic negotiation that goes on between speakers of different languages. It's like a dance. There are linguistic and facial cues that tell you that your partner didn't quite get it, and you begin to think about other ways and other words that you would use so that they might understand you better. Yet, despite many of these tricky exchanges, I never felt the expectation put upon me to change my accent to be heard. That was until I started interacting with speech devices. My daily human to human interactions in the last 12 years in the US did not mirror the same linguistic experiences I was having in digital spaces. Calling a bank and getting an automated teller would be a frustrating experience, as my letter A as in apple was often heard as E as in echo. So you could imagine as I tried to spell out a name like Halcyon Lawrence, I wouldn't get very far. There was simply no room to dance with the device when it could not hear me. Even if an American listener didn't understand me, there was always room for negotiation. Yet in the digital, none of my clear speech strategies worked with these devices. Slower, louder, and hyper-articulated speech was often mistaken by digital listeners as angry or distorted speech. And so it began to dawn on me that in digital spaces, I was not being heard. Well, what does that sound like? Let's take a little time to listen to some typical interactions I have with Amazon's personal assistant, Alexa. I want you to listen very carefully as you're going to hear me ask some questions over and over again, adjusting my vowels ever so slightly to be heard by the device. Alexa, what's the weather in Tulsa?
In Tulsa, Oklahoma, it's 69 degrees Fahrenheit with cloudy skies. Tonight, you can look for clouds with a low of 58 degrees.
Alexa, can you spell Tulsa?
Toast is spelled T-O-A-S-T.
Alexa, can you spell Tulsa?
Tulsan is spelled T-U-L-L-S-O-N.
Alexa, can you spell Tulsa?
Chosen is spelled C-H-O-S-E-N.
Alexa, can you spell thousand?
Thousand is spelled T-A-U-S-A-N.
Alexa, call Liz Hutter.
I heard you ask for Liz Hudson, but I can't find that name in your contacts. Do you have their phone number?
No.
Okay, you can always add it later under contacts in your Alexa app.
Alexa, call Liz Hutter.
I heard you ask for Liz Hada, but I can't find that name in your contacts. Do you have their phone number?
No.
Okay, you can always add it later under contacts in your Alexa app.
Alexa, call Liz Hutter.
I heard you ask for Lisa, but I can't find that name in your contacts. Do you have their phone number?
No.
Okay, you can always add it later under contacts in your Alexa app.
Alexa, call Liz Hutter.
I heard you ask for Liz Hotel, but I can't find that name in your contacts. Do you have their phone number?
No.
Okay, you can always add it later under contacts in your Alexa app.
It should be clear to you by now that the examples I have shared with you are nothing more than mere inconveniences. Surely I can go through life without needing Alexa to spell thousand or call a colleague. So if these are mere inconveniences, why do I care? And why should you? If you are listening to this talk and speak with a standard accent in your native language, you probably don't experience these mere inconveniences of not being heard, which means that you also probably have not experienced discrimination on the basis of accent. Yes, listener, accent bias is a thing. In fact, evolutionists believe that it was man's way of creating in-group bonds for survival. Even babies show a preference for their native accent. In addition, if you think about it, there are accents that you like and love and hate. The challenge, of course, is that discrimination based on accent is difficult to recognize and even harder to acknowledge. Yet there are studies that demonstrate that speakers with non-native accents are negatively perceived by listeners, are thought to be less intelligent, loyal, and competent. They face discrimination in housing, employment, and in the courts. In fact, in 2017, in one student evaluation of my teaching, the sting of accent bias became clear to me. When a student wrote, and I quote, "I'm going to be very harsh here, but please don't be offended. Your accent is horrible." As a non-native speaker of English, I had a very hard time understanding what you were saying. An example that sticks the most is you say ghoul and I hear ghoul. And I know for some of you listening right now, you just heard me say the same words twice. The student continues, and I quote, "While it was funny at first, it got annoying as the semester progressed. I was left with the impression that you are very proud of your accent. But I think that just like movie stars acting in movies and changing their accents, when you profess, you should try to speak clearly in a US accent so that non-native students can understand you better." Unquote. I was not surprised by the emotive words used by the student to express their feelings about my accent. That too has been documented in research. What was shocking was the suggestion that I should speak in a different accent to be heard. As I reflected on my students' evaluation of my accent, it struck me that this comment would have incited outrage had it been made about my race, ethnicity, or gender. Yet when it comes to accents, there's an acceptability about the practice of accent discrimination, in part because accents are not understood as markers of identity, but rather some mutable characteristic of a speaker, changeable at will. It was only after that student evaluation that I was able to put my insight into words. Are you listening? To put upon another an expectation of assimilation is oppressive. To create conditions where accent change is not negotiable by the speaker is hostile. To impose one's accent upon another is violent. Yet speech technologies demand this of non-standard speakers all the time. The December before I received this teaching evaluation, I was on my annual pilgrimage to Trinidad, and I was spending time with a friend who was an iPhone user. I watched in fascination as she interacted with Siri, first in her native Trinidadian accent. And when Siri did not hear her, my friend repeated her question in an American accent, and Siri sprang to life. Linguistic assimilation was exactly what Siri demanded of my friend if she was to be heard. Despite the numerous tech claims that these devices are revolutionary, accent bias and by extension discrimination is hard coded into these technologies. Quite simply, these devices reinscribe bias experienced in the wider society. It is again another way in which marginalized communities are not heard. For example, a study coming out of Stanford University just 5 months ago found that Black speakers using these technologies experienced word error rates of 35% compared to that of their white counterparts, who experienced word error rates around 19%. The discrimination is rooted in the American Midwestern corpora, historically used to train these devices, and it is facilitated by the lack of diversity in Silicon Valley. As researcher Joy Bulamwini states, and I quote, "Whoever codes the system embeds her views," unquote. So if our speech devices are not hearing us, it is because they have been designed that way. I do not know what the stakes are for you in the spaces that you inhabit, but I have to say that given the increasing violence around issues of race and ethnicity in the US, the lack of diversity in speech technologies is a concern for me and many others in my field. You might ask, isn't it a good thing if people of color can move through digital spaces unheard with their identities intact because of their non-standard accents? Maybe, but then again, maybe not. I look on with a sense of impending dread as I read about social and civic institutions, schools, prisons, and courts increasingly adopting listening technologies as a way to detect and assess emotion in speech of Black and Brown voices not adequately represented in speech technology training data. I fear that not being heard by machines will have deadly consequences for some. So, to return to the title of my talk, to be heard or not to be heard, well, that depends on who you are, and it depends on who is listening.
Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which you are all settled upon. We are coming from many places, and I want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and territories of Indigenous peoples who have been here since the first sunrise. In particular, I wish to acknowledge the Gadigal, Gundungurra and Wiradjuri who have practiced their sovereignty and law on their lands. I acknowledge their endless and continuous care for country, and in doing so pay my respects to their ancestors in the face of ongoing violence. Peoples whose lands and country these discussions were had. Stolen lands for which a treaty or sovereign agreement has never been negotiated, always was, always will be, Aboriginal land.
Using software online, if you put an Indigenous language in, it just says inaudible, which bracket, inaudible, close bracket, and it's like, no, that was an audible thing. You heard it. You heard that there was a thing that you didn't understand, which is a different way of saying that, right? Yeah. Like, I couldn't understand this, and versus this is inaudible.
Yeah.
Listen and hear. With the garbage up, go the go balabo. With the garbage up, go the go balabo. Listen, hear, think. Winangara. Listen. With the garbinya. Hear, think, listen. Winangara. Hear, think, listen. Winangara. Understand. Gulbar.
What is the ethical responsibility of someone who understands the importance of and the protection provided, both through invisibility, audibility, and inaudibility, given histories of colonialism in this country and others, like a lot of language and a lot of heritage and history and culture has been stopped for what was perceived as the greater good, or for the safety of the next generation, right? So to I think attend to that silence and think about, and that is an important part of it as well, I think.
Which is like, there's a dual element in that, right? Which is like, our language was forcefully taken from our communities and from our grandparents by the colonial infrastructure, but our ancestors also hid the language to keep, keeping their kids safe, and we're the beneficiaries of that safety as well. And so, like, I think we honour our ancestors by speaking language, but I think we honour our ancestors by recognising the sacrifice and the deliberateness of that act as well, on both sides. Like, it was a deliberate colonial intervention on language, but it was a deliberate familial consideration for safety.
Silence or quietness? Gilman, Dillman. Gilman, Dillman. Silence of night. Biliran, Balibalia, Baliran. Biliran, Balibalia, Baliran. Silence, hush. Courage, courage. Silent, B. Gudiyara, Gudiyara. Silent, quiet. Mugawar, Mugawar. Silent, quiet. Mugawar, Mugawar.
Again, go back to the point of the respecting of the sort of the silence as a choice, as a responsibility, in relationship to safety means that like that. But I guess that silence is material in that way. Like, silence is intentionality. Silence is.
It's not an absence.
No, exactly. Silence is not an absence. It is the presence of something. Even when it does demonstrate absence, silence is that sign. And I think it speaks to that, like, I don't know, it brings up a lot of really interesting questions, right, about like through what medium and what media is being produced by country, by an environment. To kind of come back, I guess, to why would you think about educating this is not really my own kind of insight. This kind of leans a lot on some of the conversations that I've had with people like Sean Dockrey and other people, sort of, that in this sort of like moment of kind of artificial intelligence infancy, as much as we are learning about ourselves in this process, we are sort of creating kindergartens for computerized ears, right? And like, is it then through that kind of reconceptualizing of relationality to a thing that is growing and learning that there might be some advantage or some interest in thinking about Indigenous epistemology and language as kind of world making in relationship to that? Like, what care is embodied through that new relationality? What is the relation to the AI within a network or a kind of a social, like a cultural and social relationship where material does not define being, but the other way around? Beingness is not bound by materiality from a worldview that I have been brought up in, and what that might mean for something that has materiality in and of itself, but is also kind of being in another way, and what responsibilities there are in kind of caring for that being.
I think culturally we have a better understanding of the fact that a non-human thing can speak, and that country speaks, and that our technologies are only as sophisticated as we are, but we are infinitely sophisticated, right? And the country that we come from is infinite. And how do you communicate things that we don't understand in a physical way? if I go to a sacred site on country, yes, I can feel that bodily. If I go somewhere that I'm not meant to be, I can feel it bodily. How do you teach a machine to understand that when a lot of people living on this continent don't understand that? And like, what is there a responsibility to do that? If you can teach a machine to hear country and then communicate whether someone should or shouldn't be there, like, do we have a responsibility to create that infrastructure, or do we have a responsibility to keep that information secret?
Which,
when we like expose country, do we put it at risk or do we keep it safe? And there's a tension there where technology potentially can help, but potentially creates a system that is a lot more destructive. And also, we're not the people to answer.
No, exactly. And I feel like, if anything, history has shown that, like, though there are gains that are made through the politics of visibility and being counted, you know, I think the history of Red Fern and kind of Indigenous self-determination has a larger sort of movement within the world and within Australia, for sure, was led through the counting of people, right? To necessitate the ideas, necessitate the need for health services and legal services, which were innovations and innovated by those communities to what we now use ubiquitously today, and as kind of as products of resources that have been extracted from those communities, and those communities have been left to languish, right? Can't deny the struggle and the strength and the importance and the legitimacy of every battle fought for and won by Indigenous people, but they have also systematically from that point on been undermined. Sort of the kind of, it's so at that great cost of understanding what it means to be counted and what can be gained, but then what eventually will happen.
Yeah, and like you're saying, the history of being counted in this country, right? Like, being counted has been used against us so often. Like, census data is ask racist questions and so it gets racist answers. And when our data is programmed by a racist colony, the results we get reinforce the colony. But we need to start asking questions that defy that. But can you do it in a non-quantifiable way? Or can you do it in a way where we own that information only with community? Is it Warumpi then? Are you the one that's going to stand up and be counted?
Yeah.
Oral history, and when you are story ready, which academics we're really lucky to be living in a time where academics are sort of articulating these parts of Indigenous, community care, which is not it's not a phenomenon here in Australia solely. This is like a pan sort of Indigenous understanding of oral histories, and when you can receive it and when you're deemed ready, and that when you are deemed ready, it's outside of you, right? Like, you don't have the right to decide when you can hear something. That's only your elders and your community who can determine that. So, like, how do you create AI that is story ready, and when do you determine that to happen? Like, how do you feed a non-human object information in the right order?
Yeah. And is it sort of like byproduct of the way that we think about them now, that they don't hold it in any order, that we can really, because I think what's worth touching on in a lot of ways is sort of the interesting problems of, like, at least for an algorithm, in some capacity, we don't really know how those decisions, we only see that if they've made the right decision, right? We don't see the thinking process, because an AI does not process the sound or the visuals of country in the way that we do, right? So, like, a capture is a camera recording in both directions. We don't know what it's choosing to make its decision about what it's witnessing. We only know if it's made the right decision, or if it's come up with the right outcome. And in the relationship to being story ready, or in relationship to being in a relational sense of being in a place. Humans don't think probabilistically, whereas a computer does. Like a human isn't going to. When you ask a person, what's the most probable outcome? They're going to go through. They're not immediately going to. Not everyone's going to think immediately mathematically. People are going to think through lived experience.
Right?
They're set small. So it's lived experience, and or what they think you want to hear. Whereas a computer will, to a certain extent, and probably built upon in the heuristics of it, but it'll operate off of probability, which are all sort of really interesting, like interesting questions, like what is the probability of country?
That got me thinking as well about like kind of coming back to probability and story readiness. Like how much do you feed the AI before it determines when you're story ready?
Absolutely.
Can you train something? Can you train something with that seemingly esoteric knowledge?
Being of country and responsibility to it is being placed within it and understanding at what places you intersect with it and what places that you have responsibility to be that relationality, right? So like what is your relation to the turtle? What is your relation to this tree? Defining your responsibilities in that context. And so how can you translate those? Because I feel like that is an important thing to locate if you're going to, and really the strength of what it could be to locate that for an artificial intelligence is your responsibility in relation to these things. But how do you give relation to a neural network that sits in a data center in Goop to listen in Wiradjuri country?
Yes.
And the sovereignty of the movement of that sound, of that word, through that space to the neural net and back, like that communication and that movement.
And that server, the moment you put sacred information, country knowledge into a server, the server is an activated sacred thing, right? That needs to be treated with the care of a sacred object.
Yeah.
If you create an AI that is processing country in the way that Wiradjuri understand it, that AI needs to be treated with ceremony. So like you're saying, it needs to be placed in context and in country. But it also means that if you don't care for that thing, it's a dangerous thing, right? But in what way do you care for it? Well, you have to place it. But how do you place it?
When it's placeless.
When it's placeless.
And it tries to, and that's the strength of the appeal to the kind of techno-utopian idea of what these things operate as and what the sort of field of like metadata and other sort of capture methods are, is that they're sort of, it makes sense of placeless information for,
like extract ourselves from the conversation. I don't know if we can safely extract ourselves from the conversation because the conversation's here.
I think it's too far gone.
And the technology is already being used for nefarious purposes. So we're being listened to, right? So like, let's bring in another set of ears.
All right. Joel, are you joining me?
Here I am. Nice to be with you, James, and with everyone here and the machine listening curriculum across Zoom, YouTube, Facebook. Might be some other platforms too that I'm forgetting. And we're in session 2, Lessons in How Not to Be Heard. Has already witnessed some amazing work. Halcyon Lawrence, thank you for that incredible presentation. So much to think about, and amazing to see so many comments in the chat also that are stemming from that. And the excellent work that we've just seen, video essay, video conversation, produced especially for this session of machine listening by two incredible artists, Jazz Money and Joel Spring, are the two artists that you saw there in conversation. Both Wiradjuri artists working in space between political activism, poetry, writing. Joel's also an architect, does very experimental work with Future Method. Elisa, if you can put the link in the chat, that would be great. And also perhaps a link to Joel's radio show as well, Survival Guide on Radio Skid Row, and you can see the kind of radiophonic practice coming through in that work too, in that conversation that imagines speculatively and in such expansive terms what a Wiradjuri AI might be and do, how it might operate. Joel, if you want to show yourself, it'd be really nice just to thank you for making that work, and yeah, really appreciate it. Encourage everyone to check out your work. And there was a question in the chat, which is, what does it mean to say something is story ready? And you know, we don't have too long before we're going to move on, but I just wondered, that's not a question any of us can possibly answer, but perhaps apart from you in this session, if you want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not on us. It's definitely not on Jazz and I to be able to talk about what this thing does, right? Like, I mean, I think we hold in us and wish for the future that this thing exists in, but it's not the one that we currently live in. Because I think, you know, it's not like we need the technology to get us out of the problem. We need to structurally change what we're doing, and the technology happens. So in the future that I think of, you know, the Wiradjuri AI is a no-brainer. But I think in framing what story readiness is, I mean, it's interesting to locate it because it's something that I feel like is shared among academics from Indigenous backgrounds across the globe in understanding the sort of relational responsibility to knowledge and sharing of that knowledge, and what that means to be decided to witness the stories of country, the stories embedded in ancestral belonging to place and connection to country and those things. And it's an interesting question. I think that's all we really wanted to offer, was a lot of questions about how these things could work. I can't answer that question about what story readiness means for an AI specifically, but I think it's very interesting to think about.
Thank you so much. That's more than a fantastic answer. So, and thank you once again for such a great work, and also for all the work that you've been doing with us over recent years. So we're going to change tack a little bit, move forward with the program, and hear from Karolina Ivanska from Panopticon Foundation. James, would you like to say a few words about Karolina before she starts?
I mean, you know, in a way, she's well placed to introduce herself. But I mean, I'll just say that she's a lawyer and policy analyst. She's based in Warsaw at the Panopticon Foundation, which is an amazing organization. She was 2019-2020 Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow, and you know, she's going to be presenting on, I suppose we're changing tack in a way, you know, towards a different form of kind of political work around sort of law and policy in a way. But Karolina's going to be talking about the phenomenon of the black box, or the myth of the black box. I just thought, Karolina, I'm springing on this on you live, but I wondered if maybe you could say a few words about Panopticon, if you weren't going to, just by way of introduction.
I made it part of my presentation. So
hey, there we go. Fantastic. Okay, so over to you then.
In that case, take it away.
Yeah, take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. My name is Carolina, and I'm a lawyer working at the intersection of human rights and new technologies. So I work at Panopticon Foundation, which is a Warsaw-based NGO that advocates for freedom in the context of growing surveillance by lobbying for new laws and litigating to protect fundamental rights. And today I'd like to offer you a lesson in how to debunk the myth of the silicon ear black box. The other day, my friend arrived a bit early at her therapy session while another patient was still seeing the therapist. A special sound device was installed in the waiting area, emitting white noise that muffled the voices in the room. This is only one example, but we've clearly found ways of protecting our voices from other people's unwanted attention. But how do we protect them from listening machines like smart speakers or voice assistants? How do we know who's behind them and how they interpret and use what is being said? Do we have to wait for a journalistic investigation to reveal that our flashlight app was eavesdropping on what we watch on TV to better target ads? And I thought, who better to ask than your own voice assistant?
Do you think someone else is listening to us? I don't have an answer for that.
Well, today we're not going to focus on whether we are being eavesdropped on by intelligence agencies, jealous lovers, or hackers. Instead, let's take a closer look at our listening machines themselves and the people who build them. For many users of smart speakers and voice assistants, it came as a shock that recordings of their private family conversations were being reviewed by real living humans, usually poorly paid gig economy workers working for Amazon, Apple, or Google. This was hardly surprising to anyone familiar with how voice assistants are trained, but definitely clashed with presenting these systems as fully automated AI that miraculously understands what we say without any human intervention. But nothing happens out of nowhere. While we may be entering the golden era of artificial intelligence, systems with actual self-awareness that have their own aims, goals, and intentions, also known as artificial general intelligence, remain within the realm of science fiction. A completely human-free AI is only one of the many myths and misconceptions about this technology. But arguably the most damaging one is that these systems are black boxes about which we simply cannot know anything. This myth can be particularly dangerous in cases where these systems are being used in sensitive, high-risk scenarios, such as public health or criminal justice. Machine listening is increasingly present in this sphere. For one example, the British National Health Service is already collaborating with Amazon to offer health information by voice search on Alexa. If it's not happening already, it is only a matter of time until we have our credit worthiness assessed based on our voice, or have voice stress detectors used during a job interview to identify lies. So let's ask Siri a rather straightforward question.
How do you work? I really couldn't say.
Oh, well, a surprise, surprise. Oh, people with little technical knowledge, and that includes policymakers and public authorities, often do not question the black box and accept the argument that these systems operate in a way that is simply too complex for a human to follow in detail or retrace. In reality, however, this is the case for only a small number of algorithmic systems. Most algorithms that we encounter in daily lives are nothing but decision trees or other statistical models that have been in use for decades and are only now being rebranded as the much hyped AI. In fact, even if more sophisticated models are used, like in the case of machine listening, we are often being kept in the dark, not because the inner workings of the system are obscure, but because transparency would threaten trade secrets, reveal controversial choices made by the owners of the AI system, or simply expose their marketing bullshit. In this way, opacity becomes a choice. This choice becomes problematic when AI is used to render decisions or support making decisions in situations that have consequences for humans. So what can be done about this?
Smart. I'm not a person, so I only know what I've been programmed to understand.
Well, this is a surprisingly genuine answer. There are numerous decisions that owners or designers of an AI system need to make, starting with the framing of the problem they want to solve and ending with the choice of the model they will use and how they test it. Ask any AI designer, perhaps yourself if you're one of them, and they will tell you that they want to pursue social good and make fair AI. This is surely noble, but these aims implicate political choices, as there is no single definition of social good, and there are at least 21 definitions of fairness, many of them mutually exclusive. We might never be able to agree on the common definition of good or fair AI. So what we should do instead is to agree on the process of evaluating and discussing these political choices made by the designers of AI systems. Why? Because this is where the conversation about the values embedded into AI systems really starts, with human decisions regarding the design and optimization of the whole system. And that can have grave consequences.
Do I sound Polish?
I don't have an opinion on that.
Well, Siri might not, but is there a risk that a voice assistant used by a hospital will not understand me, or that a bank will give me a different credit score based on my Polish accent, or based on whether I sound male or female, black or white, educated or not? And will I know that that was the reason? Many studies that look at discriminatory AI explain bias by bringing external factors such as poor data quality and a flawed choice of objective. And although such reasons may seem to arise from external realities that designers of the system could not control, the truth is that there is a human decision behind each of these choices. Owners of AI systems and the data scientists they employ are responsible for all such decisions. For the choice of the data, even if that choice was very limited, for deploying the system despite the fact that they could not avoid bias, for not revising their main objective, regardless of the fact that the fair outcome they hoped for could not be achieved, and finally, they are responsible for choosing to use an automated system in the first place, despite being aware of its limitations and possible consequences. In the black box narrative, we do not have access to these decisions. If we do not know what the system is optimized for, what its real goal is, what were the trade-offs that developers accepted, we can't hold it to account.
Do you think technology is neutral?
I don't have an answer for that.
Well, it's not hard to imagine that in 5 or 10 years, we will interact with voice assistants rather than people, not only to set an alarm or order groceries, but also in situations where we are the subject of risk assessment or where incredibly sensitive decisions with a massive impact on our lives are made about us. Employing listening machines instead of people is alluring. After all, silicon ears are in the long term cheaper than ears made of flesh and bone. They render their decisions based on hard historical data and not on emotions immediately and in a way that is easy to compare and revise over time. And in this way, they are perfectly apolitical, right? Just like the UK's school grading algorithm that gave worse grades to students from disadvantaged backgrounds was perfectly apolitical. Whether we like it or not, in the context of AI implementations, technology is rarely neutral. Sometimes the effects it has on our lives are clear and palpable. Sometimes they're more subtle and visible after a long time. Take the accounts of parents and children development experts claiming that Alexa undermines kids' naturally developing curiosity, creativity, tolerance for distress, and empathy. After Amazon introduced a smart speaker for kids, some senators in the US asked if Amazon worked with child development experts while creating it, and what mechanisms are in place, if any, to understand the impact of using the speaker on children's development. These are exactly the questions, the kind of questions we should be able to ask companies and governments, and they should be required to answer legally, not only when they feel like it. In order to maintain a level of scrutiny over AI systems, we do not have to open the technical black box and understand all the technical parameters in the machine learning process. The basic thing that we can and should demand is transparency of the human decisions behind AI systems that will allow us, civil society, artists, regulators, courts, to understand the choices, assumptions, and trade-offs made by the people who designed them, which all shape the behavior of the algorithm. It will allow us to see and potentially challenge the political decisions that inform technical choices, particularly when used in the public sector. Without such transparency, we are denied the possibility of political participation, as contentious decisions are hidden inside the black box narrative, and power is outsourced to AI to avoid responsibility.
Do you have an answer for everything?
I don't have an answer for that.
Thank you.
My great-uncle Farhan was known for stealing the stories of others. He was so shameless about it that when he self-published his own autobiography, all the villagers were shocked to read that he had appropriated their late uncle's war tales, that he had pilfered their dead father's adventures as a student living in Europe, or that he had stole their long-past grandfather's business acumen from their time in Saudi Arabia. That he had stole their long-past grandfather's business acumen from their time living in Saudi Arabia. The strange thing is that Farhan was not a famous man. There was no audience for his book outside the village. And yet everyone in the village who read the book knew that those stories did not belong to Farhan. Perhaps this is why there was an unusual and disrespectful level of noisiness and chatter at his funeral. Perhaps this is why there was a disrespectful level of noisiness and chatter at his funeral. Despite the disarray, somehow a sign that the open casket was ready to enter the room networked its way. Despite the disarray, somehow a sign that the open casket was ready to enter the room networked its way through the room like ice freezing everything in its path. I turned my head to face the silence, and at that moment I was met with a dreadful sound. I turned my head away from my uncle to face the silence, and at that moment I was met with a dreadful sound. 1,000 white plastic chairs scraping the tiles as they were picked up, dragged and stacked on top of each other in rows that lined the four walls of this vast multi-use municipal hall. This clearing of the chairs was to make way for the casket and to ensure the attendees stood in respect of the dead. Its physical amplitude was vast, but what made it more horrible was its object quality. Its low, coarse, granular groan was accompanied by a whistled scrape that seared up and beyond the frequency spectrum of what is humanly audible. This horrific sound, buttressed by silence, has stayed with me ever since. And though I saw his corpse that day, I can no longer really recall how he looked, what he was wearing, and how his face was exhibited. And yet the sound that preceded his appearance has been etched into my cortex. In 1968, Alistair Cook, the BBC correspondent to the US, was one of the many witnesses to the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. His account included an unusual detail. He said that there was suddenly a banging repetition of a sound that I don't know how to describe. Not at all like gunshots, but like somebody dropping a rack of trays. Even after the fact of him knowing that what he had heard was gunshots, he still retained the sonic image of the rack of trays as a central part of his testimony. it's as if the rack of trays was a kind of buffer to reality, the last thing standing between what actually happened and an imaginary realm of alternate scenarios where what happened never happened. The sound of the rack of trays become a relic of the split second between the event and its reckoning. This split second can endure for years and years and years before the event is reconciled for what it in fact was. There was an 8-year gap, for example, until the translators of the Nuremberg trials finally began to speak and write about what they had heard and translated. There was an 8-year gap between the act of translation and the ability to speak of the translation by the translators in Nuremberg. One gets so attached to the wording that one does not notice the content, Henry Lee, a Nuremberg translator, explained. Only years later, one awakes gradually and realizes the content that has been registered somewhere subconsciously, he said. This meant that the monstrosities of the Nazi war criminals that were translated by the interpreters became conscious in and of themselves only with a delay of time. This lapse in time was due to the fact that a partial elimination of their consciousness was required to make the task of simultaneous translation possible. They had to listen to other people's voices while they are themselves speaking, and to do this, they become somewhat machinic. Interpreters have to react to spoken words at reflex-like speeds. The simultaneous translators had one instrument, however, that was able to slow the speed of sound that flowed into their headphones. The simultaneous translators had one instrument that would slow the speed of sound that flowed into their headphones. A yellow and red light bulb built into the witness stand and prosecutor's podium. The interpreters could control these lights. Flashing the yellow light once signaled the order to speak slower, while 3 quick pulses demand the speaker raise their voice. 1 red flash indicated a sentence need repeating. 1 red flash indicated a sentence need repeating. 1 red flash indicated a sentence needed repeating. These lights became somewhat of a rude interruption. The judges despised them because they removed their autonomy to control the speaking subjects in their court. Similarly, the Nazi perpetrators loathed them because they could not conceive of a hierarchical inversion in which a translator was permitted to instruct and interrupt a general. The witnesses hated them because the lights illuminated moments of vocal inadequacy, be it a signal that they were too quiet or too fast, reminded them of the tremendous scrutiny to which their voices were being heard. And heard not only inside the court, but relayed radiophonically to a world well beyond the walls of the courthouse. In this mass media event, the lights exposed moments in which they became unintelligible. The flare of the red light emblazoned their faces at the moment where they struggled most to make what they had seen speakable. The red light emblazoned their face in the moments when they struggled the most to make what they had seen speakable. We have no recordings of the voices of the Nuremberg translators in the act of translation. The only record we have of their presence is the red and yellow lights that silently flashed in the filmed footage. When we cross-reference the moments where we see these flashes with the trial transcript, we quickly notice that these illuminate interruptions have been deleted. Though we can hear the system being discussed on the original recordings, in the trial transcript there is no record of such moments like when the flashing of the red light, the order to repeat, totally derailed a witness's train of thought. moments where the flashing of the red light totally derailed a witness's train of thought. Or how the judges had to step in to decode the meaning of a flashing yellow light that dumbfounds a witness on the stand. In the transcript of the trial, the relay from voice to voice appeared smooth and seamless. The task of the stenographer, then, was to free testimony from its very sounding. I met with a court stenographer in London, and he described to me that in order to type at the speed of speech, one has to enter a state he termed autopilot mode. To access this plane of consciousness, the trial stenographer find a single ornament architectural ornament or detail in the room. Perhaps it's the top right corner of a window cornice, or the beveling of an architrave, or the point where the crown molding meets the ceiling. While their eyes scan every centimeter of this object, a preconscious channel opens between their ears and their fingertips. This not only allows them to type at the necessary speed, but it also creates an acoustic force field to protect them from the otherwise heavy labor of having to spend days and days listening to content which can often pertain to violence and fatality. Courtroom stenographers are becoming increasingly rare in criminal trials in the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And it's not because their labor is becoming automated, but it rather is becoming outsourced. More and more criminal trials are being audio recorded, and these recordings are being sent for transcription to a collection of companies based in Ahmedabad in India. A perfect combination of reduced labor cost, time difference, and a shared common law legal system enforced on India during British colonial rule mean that India has become the ideal candidate for them to transcribe the trials of their former colonizers and their former colonizers' former colonies. What saves the courts the most money in this context is that no special training is required for the stenographer, as they are not transcribing in real time, and so they do not need to know how to enter the stenographic keyhole that allows them to type at the speed of sound. They can simply pause and rewind the recording to make sure that each word is recorded verbatim. The pause button creates a portal through which a cacophony of malign voices directly flow into comprehension. The pause and rewind button inaugurate new conditions of labor for the transcriber. Although they are geographically much further away from the courtroom, they are somehow much closer to the testimonies than the stenographer who sits just meters away from the witness stand. There is also a paradox in time. The pause and rewind buttons slow the overall labor. They accelerate the time it takes for the information to become envisaged. The Gujarati transcribers have no acoustic force field, no architectural ornament, no 8-year lapse of subconscious processing, no rack of trays, and no 1,000 white plastic chairs, nothing to soften the collision between the sound and what that sound means.
Okay. Why are you laughing?
I'm sort of laughing at the impossibility of following Lawrence Abu Hamdan's monologue, but I also, just because I have the words stenographic K-hole just kind of resonating endlessly in my mind. But please, you attempt to back announce and say something about that work.
Sure thing. So yeah, for those of you who don't know Lawrence's work, that was Lawrence Abu Hamdan. He's a British Lebanese artist, researcher, audio investigator, and he's associated quite sort of famously with a London-based research agency called Forensic Architecture, and it's sort of for work coming out of that association that he recently was a joint winner of the Turner Prize in a kind of an interesting political move. I won't go into that, but just to say that his work has kind of consistently been concerned with questions of forensic listening, which is to say listening as a forensic scientist would, but also listening around law and legal institutions. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we wanted to put him into dialogue, his work into dialogue with Carolina's. This is a new work. I'm actually not aware of the title yet. I think it's so newly off the shelf that I'm not sure it has one, but it will be shown at the end of the year at the Kunstverein Nuremberg, which I've terribly mispronounced. And I guess one of the challenges for us curatorially was to think about why that work should be in this program, because we sort of feel intuitively that it should, and yet it's not about AI exactly. I mean, even at the end of the work there, Lawrence says explicitly, the sort of the disappearance of the court stenographer is not primarily by virtue a result of automation. It's a result of labor relations and changing labor relations and outsourcing, the politics of outsourcing, which also relates to something that Carolina was saying about the kind of the artificial intelligence that often sort of underpins these systems. So why would this work that's not about AI belong in this program? We were speaking with Lawrence. We conducted an interview with him that is not quite finished. We haven't quite finished editing it yet for the interview series, but it'll be up soon. And we spoke with. I mean, a lot of his work does concern AI, and we spoke with him about this one. And he said, well, if this work doesn't belong in a program about machine listening, then none of my work does. And it was a really provocative statement. And I think we've been trying to get our heads around what he means by that. And I think we sort of eventually come to the conclusion that this is a history lesson. There's a story being told here about the changing relations between man-machine system. Obviously that work concerns the invention of simultaneous interpretation at the Nuremberg trials in the aftermath of World War II. And it's worth knowing as an anecdote, I've done some work on this story too, that this system of simultaneous interpretation was invented there. But it wasn't the technology that was invented. The audio technology that sort of allowed for this whole kind of exercise to take place was called the IBM Hushaphone system. And it was patented in 1926, but used for the first time in 1927, many years before Nuremberg. But it was at Nuremberg that the system that Lawrence describes, the system of that allowed the trial to be conducted in multiple different languages over a complex sort of relay system of headphones and speakers and so on, with transcribers and so on, and the lights that he describes. That system, which is a socio-technical system that enables and sort of governs and disciplines forms of speech in relation to machines. That's what's invented at Nuremberg for a specifically legal reason, and it has sort of really important legacies because that system sort of remains, foundational to contemporary international relations. Like simultaneous interpretation is what allows the UN to function smoothly today, even though obviously English is a kind of a globalized language in a certain kind of way. So I think, one way of understanding that work is, and I'm conscious of reading too much into it. But in the context of this program, is that there's a story about the histories of speaking to machines and being disciplined by the machines to which you speak. And I think that, that's a story that can relate it to, Carolina's project, but also back through Joel Jazz and to Halcyon's.
And I mean, and definitely to Alex Ahmed's project, which we're about to move into now. And Alex is a programmer and a researcher who works at Northeastern University in the United States in computer sciences, and she developed this amazing project collaboratively, a kind of a community built software application, Project Spectra, which is a sort of a voice training, transforming, modifying application for trans folk to use to get feedback on their own voices, and to kind of enter a market that in some ways was oh yeah, Alex is reminding us that she actually graduated, which I think might have just happened.
And you're welcome to say hello, Alex. If we weren't totally sure if you were present.
Come on, yeah.
Hi.
It's so nice of you to join us from the what's the is it the holodeck?
No, this is the bridge. Thank you very much.
Oh, the bridge. My bad. But it was so nice to connect with you and to chat about Project Spectra. And there's and your work more broadly. And there's an interview in the interview index on the machine listening curriculum that goes into more depth. But today you're going to present on some voice applications, and we're going to hear and see them in action.
Yeah, and I actually pre-recorded the talk to make sure that the tech issues didn't exist. So yeah, y'all can go ahead and play that, and I'll be in the chat and also on Discord. If you want to reach out, my username on the Discord is matriarchy. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Ahmed, and I'm here to present work I conducted over the course of my PhD. My work is titled Collaborative Design of Voice Training Software for Transgender People. But I want to begin at what I see as an inflection point. According to the New York Times, the share of Americans who believe that technology companies have a positive impact on society has dropped. And there's no shortage of controversies that I could point to elaborate on this. From ever more sophisticated facial recognition software deployed by law enforcement agencies despite widespread protests against it, to algorithmic management by gig economy corporations, in which workers are continuously hooked into performance monitoring tools programmed to exploit them by maximizing their work and minimizing their pay, to computer science research that completely erases transgender people, rendering our needs, experiences, and identities completely invisible. I don't want to just say this. It's not just that these individual things are bad. The purpose of the critique here is to shed light on why things are bad through examining the larger social issues at play. We see across all of these examples systematic denials of agency, in which people are unable to determine how technology is built and how it affects our lives. Over the course of this talk, I'll emphasize the concepts of power and agency in relation to how technologies are designed and developed, focusing specifically on the needs and experiences of transgender people. First, some quick definitions. A transgender person does not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, whereas a cisgender person does. To misgender someone means to refer to them as the incorrect gender. So the goal of this project was to create a technology for transgender voice training. So let's begin by explaining what that is. How trans people experience their speaking voices can vary widely. Some choose to or are able to pursue formalized voice training to change the way their voices sound in some way. Others don't. Those who do pursue it could be aiming for a higher or lower pitch, a more consistent or a variable pitch. It could also be the more complex task of changing the way your speaking voice resonates. It can be very distressing to feel like your voice doesn't represent you, or that it opens you up to being identified as transgender against your will and potentially harassed or assaulted. None of these are universal experiences, but this is a persistent issue that people can come up against in their day-to-day life, regardless of whether they choose to pursue voice training or not. Over half of transgender women, or about 62%, are interested in voice training or have done it. Professional therapists and specialists are an option for those who can afford or access them, but there are also a number of online resources, YouTube, forums, and mobile apps, for example, that all aim to support trans people in working on their voices. Clinical research on speech therapy for trans people has suggested relationships between one's voice, mental health, and identity, so how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. To unpack this more fully, we can bring in the concept of embodiment. Embodiment describes our experience in the world, which includes our experience of physical reality and social reality. Embodiment and health are connected. Our well-being is secured when we feel comfortable in our own skin, so that's our physical reality, but also in our relationships with others, so that's our social reality. When it comes to actually satisfying these needs, we need to think about power. We can consider our ability to self-determine our physical and social reality as the power to do something. However, our power is constrained in the face of discrimination, if some extrinsic influence holds power over us. So true self-determination and agency are impossible under this condition. Take the example of being denied insurance coverage, which 1/3 of trans people experience. Your ability to obtain healthcare is being superseded by a social institution that says, no, actually, you can't. And I think it's important to point early on to a wider social context. We've seen what appears to be progress in terms of the social acceptance of transgender people through appearances in the worlds of film, television, fashion, and even academic scholarship. But as Tourmaline explains in the anthology Trapdoor, these doors of acceptance can also be traps. Acceptance remains gated to those who can best conform to certain gendered expectations, and that includes voice. And we're not just talking about acceptance in terms of a fuzzy feeling in the hearts and minds of the general population. With acceptance comes the promise of improved material conditions, access to resources, healthcare, employment, safety, and security. For example, not too long ago, the ability of transgender women to access transition-related healthcare hinged on their perceived feminine appearance, their desire to date men, or even how attractive they were to their doctors. And so my project aimed to combat marginalization and health disparities by democratizing access to voice training resources. At the same time, I sought to address a host of issues and limitations with existing apps. To elaborate on this, I want to show you how these existing voice training apps work. So let's get into it. This is a voice training app called Eva. It has two versions, one for transgender women, so that's this one, and also one for transgender men, that's here. On the F side, we see a thin woman wearing a white dress, gazing wistfully out on a beach. On the M side, we see a man wearing a suit, a gold vest, and for some reason, a top hat or fedora. So immediately we see gender stereotypes jumping out at us, but that's not all that's going on here. We also see that these are white people who have a certain upper class aesthetic about them based on where they're located or based on their manner of dress. We also can't see their faces, which invites the user to identify with them or as them. However, not everyone can identify with these images. Let's look into how these voice training apps present information. I'm going to go into their voice feminization fundamental section. And here's the sample lesson. I can't actually show you anything else because it requires a payment of $80. So let's get into this.
Let's begin by taking a look at the 9 elements of an exceptional voice.
What are they?
They are pitch, voice quality, loudness, resonance, articulation, phrasing, pacing, melodic intonation, and fluency. Now let's define each of these elements.
Let's skip ahead a bit.
Smooth and blending. Then think of some modern rock and roll music or rap music, and it has a very staccato beat to it. Men tend to speak in more of a staccato manner. Women tend to speak in more of a flowing manner.
Note the relationship here between male masculinity and rap music and rock music versus melodic music. I think that there's also something we need to say in terms of race and how race is sort of connected to gender. And so whiteness here and white supremacy is an integral part of how normative gender is understood.
And future lessons of Eva work on fluency.
This music is very dystopic.
For this sampler, we're going to work with pitch, resonance, melodic intonation, and fluency.
Let's look at also, let's look at how voice is analyzed in these apps. So I can't show you all of these tools because they're behind a paywall, but this one is an interesting visualization. It is trying to get you to stay on a 220 hertz pitch, which is supposed to be a good place to begin if you want to feminize your voice. So as you can see, I'm very much in the red. And if you are able to stay on 222 hertz, you get a really nice green signal on this bullseye here. But if you're not, you're the red. So harmful tropes about trans people can play out functionally as well as aesthetically in terms of how the user's data are analyzed and presented. So let's check out another app that I think shows this really well. So this is Christella Voice Up, made by a speech therapist named Christella Antoni. So let's see what she has to say.
This app is designed to help develop the female voice. For over 20 years, I've been helping transgender individuals modify their voices using the Antoni M2F and F2M voice change models.
Her credibility is really important here.
Especially in male to female transition, often presents as one of the most challenging aspects of change.
It's really interesting because you don't often see the creators of an app present themselves in a video in the app itself. This is very strange. But I think that who the therapist is and how they're presenting gives them an air of credibility. Like, this is me. I'm going to be your ambassador to femininity. So let's see if we can get an analysis of my voice here. Also, interesting subnote, there's a lot of lipstick motifs in these apps. Like, check out this one. Again. But anyways, that's that. So let's do a voice assessment. It's going to want me to read this passage, but I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to continue to talk. And it wants me to talk some more for 30 seconds. So I don't really care what my data is here. I just want to show you what the output looks like. So I read the passage and I received a readout of my pitch. But this chart is showing me like my gender ranges as a percentage based on how often I was in that range. But that's not actually ever explained to the user. So while some people may immediately understand this to mean like 80% of my speech was in the masculine or male pitch range, I think that this design choice also evokes harmful slurs about transgender people being partly men, partly masculine, partly feminine, whereas our actual identities are much more complex than that. So this is really reducing this down to a bite-sized chunk of data here. I think also that the design decision to render these gender categories as separate colors emphasizes their construction as completely separate categories that do not permit any fluidity or mixing or crossing between them. discard that. So moving on, though, I want to ask how we could create digital tools for more liberatory ends. And so to do that, I want to show you what our app looks like. So I started an online organization, which was eventually named Project Spectra. Our mission was to build free and open source voice training software by and for transgender people. We worked online asynchronously for about a year and a half before we created our first prototype. The app features real-time pitch tracking, as seen in the screenshot on the left, as well as a visualization that takes into account users' own personal voice goals, as seen on the right. This work was a way for us to reclaim agency over how voice tracking technologies are made. Our design goals, which we decided together, were affirmation, playfulness, and care. I want to walk you through our app to show how we put those ideals into practice. Our first goal, affirmation, stated that users should feel supported and represented, and feel that their choices are validated and respected by the app. To accomplish this, users can personalize the app with their name and specific goals for voice training, and change both of those at any time. Our care goal meant that users should never feel strained, overworked, or overwhelmed. The app should project a sense of clarity, restfulness, and trust. We worked with a speech therapist to create this screen, which presents vocal health tips during the onboarding section of the app. I'm going to choose my goal here. So our group ultimately decided to prioritize vocal health rather than comparison against gender categories. Vocal strengthening exercises, commonly used by speech therapists, are useful regardless of what users' voice goals are. In so doing, our app departs from other offerings in that we don't assume a fixed destination for one's voice. Woo! Voice training can also be extremely stressful. We wanted to counteract that by making the app as fun as we possibly could. Our last experience goal was therefore playfulness. The app should be welcoming and encouraging to users without seeming condescending or childish. One of our members created the initial concept for this cartoon character. This exercise is our take on those offered by other apps that present a readout of the user's pitch in comparison to normative gender ranges. We emphasize care, affirmation, and user control throughout the design by using text-based feedback, encouragement text, and inclusion of the user's own goals. Rather than base our feedback in gendered language, such as "your voice sounds male," we center the user's own choices. At this early stage of development, we welcome any feedback, so please reach out if you'd like to try it out, or even if you just want to connect. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was so fantastic. There's some really great feedback in the chat over here. I don't know if you want to pop up your head and just say goodbye or anything. You don't have to, but yeah, it was great. I really appreciated that. That was fantastic. So I don't know if people want to get over on into the Discord or the chat window or anything to talk with Alex, but you're very welcome to. Anything you wanted to say by way of closing, Alex, or is it all been said?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's just really great to be here and great to be with all these other panelists. And thanks so much for inviting me on.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
We're going to do a clunky segue now into Matt Dryhurst and sort of move the conversation in a slightly different direction. So I kind of want to use...
we're coming also to the kind of last part of the session too, aren't we? It's Matt, and then we've got one final performance by DeForest Brown Junior Speaker Music. So it's getting there. But yeah, sorry I interrupted. But welcome.
No, not at all. No, you're quite right. And look, so I don't know if people, how many people were at last night's performance or yesterday's performance, but you might have been there, excuse me, at the end for a performance of a new work by a Melbourne artist Tom Smith called Top 10, in which he takes Spotify data of different national charts and then sort of runs it through a range of different statistical parameters, and then kind of produces these new songs that kind of are the kind of perfect generic encapsulation of that country's chart music. So it's like Brazil and France and Australia and whatever, and they're kind of really weird sounding, but they're sort of fully generic. That's kind of the logic anyway. So there's an essay about it, and up on the website. But in the performance, Tom played some of these tracks just for 5 seconds, right? And he went through it. I found it kind of brutal, right? Because he would just play like 5 seconds of each pop track, one after another, and then his sort of statistical composite. And it was kind of like a form of like data extraction, right? He was like, we weren't really listening, we were sort of extracting. And then this morning, YouTube pulled the whole of the live stream from yesterday. So we had 3-hour performance, and because of an automated content ID system, which we think uses machine listening, although it's very opaque and it's kind of impossible to know what's going on, and that's precisely the problem to some extent. It just pulled the whole thing. So there was so Sony and some other companies, set their algorithms to work, and the whole of last night's performance got pulled from YouTube. And
we might get it back. Let's say
we might get it back. But this was literally a lesson in how not to be heard, performed by an algorithm machine listening. And, it just strikes me that there's something really symptomatic about this, particularly at the time, in which the pandemic and the political responses to the pandemic have, are streamifying culture, right? As we speak, that we were originally going to do this program live, in person, and there are many ways in which this is sort of richer for happening online. But one of the things that happens when we're forced to do this online is that we get forced into copyright regimes and related forms of legal and corporate power that we wouldn't have been subject to otherwise. Because if we'd put on the show in a live venue, Tom could have performed, it wouldn't have been an issue. And even if it had been, there would have been the form of redress would have been some kind of legal proceedings, and we would have been able to argue our case that this was fair use or citation or parody even, and none of this was available to us. So what happened last night was the automation of judgment in the context of a pandemic and the kind of streamification, onlineification of culture. And if you're thinking about IP and streaming culture and music, there are a few people that are better placed to speak to that question than Matt Dryhurst, who also so happens to be a composer with Holly Herndon and others, who works with machine listening systems themselves. So we just sort of, that's a sort of a lot of context to handball over to you, Matt. But I wondered if I know that you want to speak about IP and in relation to sort of contemporary music production. But I wondered if you had, as a sort of starting point, any kind of reflections on that anecdote, or if you wanted to kind of spin it off.
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's kind of funny, right? And I mean, that's one thing. It's funny that our kind of line, at least when thinking about COVID, in a sense, is it's providing a bit of a dress rehearsal for the world to come, right? And what you all are experiencing with these takedowns. We had a conversation recently. We've been doing like a podcast thing during lockdown, and we had a conversation.
It's great,
with
by
this
the way.
guy. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's too much work, honestly. Doing one a week is a lot. But we were having a conversation with the people over at Mixcloud who, and it's funny because in a sense, COVID, the line to me at least was, it's allowed us to kind of inspect different foundations or different support systems that we have, right? Like the topic of essential workers or essential support networks just comes to the fore, and it's been really interesting speaking to certain maybe smaller service providers when it comes to live streaming, who for the past 10 years have actually set it up so that DJs or performers are able to use copyright protected works in their streams, and all those licenses are taken care of. So it's kind of funny that a very small plucky platform like Mixcloud, for example, would not have pulled down this, whereas YouTube, obviously owned by Google, does not have those systems in place. And I mean, that's a clunky segue to what I want to talk about in a sense, right? Because the idea when we think about machine learning and machine listening, for that matter, a lot of the work that we've been doing is looking at the idea of sovereignty, or as Alex just put it, agency, and what precedents we're inheriting from the 20th century that either put us in an advantageous or a disadvantageous position when it comes to incoming machine learning systems, or rapidly proliferating machine learning systems. And it was funny. I mean, it struck me also that your call, forgive me, I don't know the exact phraseology for this, but whenever I deal with Australian organizations, rightly, you begin with this: is it a call to country?
Acknowledgement of country.
Acknowledgement of country, excuse me. And the one kind of term that always sticks with me whenever I hear it is this idea that sovereignty has not yet been ceded, right? Which is funny, because when we think about a YouTube, or at least the beginnings of all of these large kind of rapacious aggregation services like a Google, that sovereignty also has not yet been ceded, right? So when we look at kind of precedents for what we're prepared to accept with these coming technologies, and we look back to basically what has been foisted upon us. Google never asked permission to index the web and sell services on top of it, right? Like this is, and actually that principle, at least the work I've been doing, is looking at those principles and trying to determine where they come from, right? So on the one hand, you have the kind of famous, if anyone's familiar with Grace Hopper, who's well acknowledged as one of the first computer hackers, the establishment of this principle of ask forgiveness, do not ask permission. The move fast, break things kind of ethos, that has I mean, there's definitely been some successes and some things to celebrate that have come from that principle. But when we look more specifically within music, also similarly, the kind of the 20th century story of sampling culture, right? This idea that you as an individual with tools at your disposal have the right ultimately to take from somebody else. And our work has been looking very much specifically on the idea of kind of vocal sovereignty, right? So the idea of, is your voice your own? Is a community's voice their own, sufficient to the point whereby they may be able to impede other people in using it for training purposes, or as is rapidly coming, in kind of like puppeteering scenarios, right? Like, are we able to protect our voices from being mimicked by others? And the kind of the way we boil it down ultimately is that, in a sense, all of those trends of the 20th century, with both their successes and failures, can be boiled down to kind of a fetishization of the individual. Right, and this idea of independence, which those involved in music cultures will be very familiar with, right? We attribute a lot of goodwill toward the idea of independent music, independent artists, and our line, at least, is to say, well, having somewhat more of an understanding of how these systems work, these systems that are coming down the line work, and to speak to also what Carolina was saying related to black boxes, right, is that these systems don't work on their own. Actually, they work as a result of being trained on all of us. And in fact, when you take kind of a critical lens at the machinations or the developments of the 20th century, it is in fact like and far beyond that, mind you, it is in fact a story of kind of invisible labor, right? Like, just as Google Translate doesn't give you the ability to tell where those human translations came from, the history of the music industry is a history of people who have contributed a great deal, and yet we don't know who they are. And so to continue the critique of sample culture, for example, I don't quite love to bring up, but I always think it's important to bring up, for example, Gregory C. Coleman, the Black American drummer who performed the Amen break and died homeless on the streets of Atlanta, never seeing a penny for it, right? So in the story of Gregory C. Coleman, we see both kind of the failures of traditional copyright systems to attribute brilliance and creativity. And we also see the failures of this kind of rapacious sampling culture in kind of attributing and compensating people for the value that they have brought to the world. And so I can keep talking about this forever, and you also can feel free to interject because I prefer it to be conversational, but I could talk forever about this.
Well, why don't I ask you to say something about this specific project that you've been working on around IP? Sort of, I don't remember its name, I'm afraid. Just to sort of give some specificity to it.
Great, yeah. So basically, related to IP, there isn't actually a name for it, other than the kind of loose code word of interdependence or interdependent systems. But the basic idea is we're at a point now, for those of you who maybe are familiar with the OpenAI Jukebox project, which basically scraped millions and millions of hours of people's work and voices in order to be able to auto-generate songs in the specific image of specific artists, right? So there's songs by Aretha Franklin and Frank Sinatra and so on and so forth. We've been looking at these systems and trying to figure out how it might be possible, rather than simply having one large organization with the compute power available to them to produce works in other people's names in perpetuity, how you might set up some kind of a collective IP structure that allows for large groups of people to be able to donate their works toward training of machine learning systems, and in turn, for those licenses to be able to distribute proceeds or funds raised by those systems to the group, to the collective. And in fact, again, speaking to the Australian and acknowledgement of country context, actually the precedent for this pretty much exclusively comes through Indigenous collective IP precedent. The idea of Indigenous or Aboriginal protocols for how indeed to be able to protect works that were created by a group of people in which it's very, very difficult to discern what particular individual did what, right? When you're talking about cultural legacy works or something like that. And the reason we find this particularly interesting is that you can also extend this principle out to other kind of less abstract fields. Like, for example, we've also proposed, and they're seeing some adoption, some positive news related to the DJ economy, for example. That, in a sense, whether it is you're training a machine learning model in order to produce a piece of work, or whether you're using a bunch of people's work in order to make a personal profit performing those works as a DJ at a music festival, we need systems in place to be able to attribute and remunerate people from source. And I think that the interesting category that this opens up, and it's not just us thinking about this. I mean, there's a professor at Harvard Law, Ruth Okadiji, who I think is kind of the leader in this space, is really just making that kind of mental leap from thinking about the protection of IP as being about individual rights, which is, of course, a very controversial and quite storied and complicated history, into thinking about how to protect a collective cultural IP in the face of new technological challenges. And so, yeah, I mean, I can talk a bit more about that. To be honest, it's like a lot of it's in the weeds, and the precedents aren't kind of like super high fidelity. But the ultimate point to us is that I personally have come to the conclusion that there's kind of no other real way to address this, right? And the analogy I use when I think about individual IP versus collective IP is, when you look at conversations related to data rights, for example, there's a lot of, particularly on the libertarian spectrum of things, projects looking at the idea of personal data markets, which honestly I find heinous. But when we start looking at large platforms, say a Facebook or something like that, In actuality, if you were to break down the value of our contributions to those platforms down to an individual check, the individual checks would probably be, anyone estimates, between something like $1 and $10 per person, right? And so thinking about these things as collective systems is also advantageous, because when you're talking about being compensated for the digital labor that you perform, a million $10 checks can produce a lot more common infrastructure for people than a million individual $10 checks most likely would. And so thinking about collective IP as a kind of category, I feel like isn't going away and has applications in the creative arts, as obviously sticky and hairy as the history of IP and copyright is.
Matt, I was wondering if you could bring the conversation about collective IP around to your work as a composer. And, I'm sort of thinking back to, what you were saying about, voice sovereignty and the question of Spawn, which is sort of trained on, is it trained on many voices or on?
It is, yeah.
Sort of, yeah. And so, I mean, I suppose the question is what does collective vocal sovereignty sound like? How might it be kind of used artistically, creatively? What have you learned from doing that about the sort of, let's say, experimental potential of the work, bit beyond, let's say, the political economy of it?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so for those who don't know, so my partner Holly and I did a project. We call it's kind of code word Spawn. It's basically like a machine learning project where we were focused on the voice, and we released a record a couple of years ago called Proto. And the basic idea there was, we would work in collaboration with the machine learning system as a performer in a wider ensemble. And all of the information that was used to train the machine learning voice was derived from people we knew, right? So people in the ensemble. And so the basic idea there, beyond the political economy of it, was that we didn't want to, go and steal stuff from other people. We wanted to know the people the system was trained upon. And in fact, as a result, we are also accountable to those people in kind of a cool way, right? Those people come on tour with us. There is an economy around their contributions to what we do. But I think in terms of like creative expression, it's really cool in a sense, one. And to give also a lot of credit, I really actually on the podcast really want to get De La Soul on. And for those who know De La Soul, I mean, like hip hop pioneers, literally like, the kind of the cut and sample hip hop style, they are, they've contributed a great deal to the history there. And in fact, they did something very similar to us with Spawn on records more recently, right? Where they would assemble ensembles to be able to train, to be able to sample from, right? So that they knew everybody whose work was contributing to it. They get to retain the aesthetics of sampling while also being able to be held accountable to those who produce the work. I think, like blue sky thinking, where we're at currently with it is that, the systems are getting a lot better. I mean, I'd say a few times, at least within the research community, artificial singing that will pass the Turing test is around the corner. And the idea that I quite like about this is, thinking of ways with small groups of people to be able to augment each other, right? To be able to augment each other's capacities. The idea of saying that my singing voice, which is actually surprisingly not as bad as you'd imagine it would be, but the idea of being able to augment my singing voices with the contributions of people who could hold me accountable for the use of their voice is actually pretty exciting. And so the sticky part here is like being able to acknowledge the great potential of some of these technologies without just kind of stepping over people, which as sadly societally we are wont to do. But the augmentative capacity of being able to sing like somebody else, or to sing with a partial inflection of somebody else, these are remarkable potentials that I think, and it comes down to me ultimately the reason why we've emphasized provenance, and we've emphasized the kind of communal potential of these things, is also that you want to move away again from this kind of like the anonymous, right? And I mean, I think to speak to the project, the Spotify project you mentioned earlier, that I still need to spend time checking out. I feel bad. I should have come more prepared. There is this kind of, one wonders, like, what does an auto-tune sound like that communicates a place, that communicates something more specific, or an accent, actually, to speak to Halcyon's great presentation earlier. one of the things that I love, for example, about like drill music or trap music is, in a sense, you have the anonymity. There's a degree of anonymity to all the production elements, and yet all of the value actually is in the cadence. All of the value is in the accent. Like Australian drill, Irish drill, South London drill. If you were to put the notes down on a piece of paper, that wouldn't tell you very much, actually, and a machine wouldn't be able to tell very much. It's actually all of the beautiful things about the accents of the performers are what gives it its special quality. And so I think that, emphasizing that, not to use the word local, because that can often be used parochially. Can be used negatively. But to emphasize some idea of identity or specialness to that community or that place where something comes from is particularly interesting to us, at least, when most kind of catastrophic predictions about machine learning are talking about instead kind of sanding away all of those edges, right? Like being able to produce infinite meaningless music in perpetuity is not very interesting to us, and I've no doubt it's probably not very interesting to anybody attending an Unsound and Liquid Architecture event.
Thank you so much, Matt. I think that's kind of nicely wraps things up, and it's maybe a good opportunity as well to invite all of the artists who've contributed tonight to turn on their cameras and say hello, because we're kind of all, presenting from all over the world. I mean, we're possibly going to be in Krakow together, and if we were, we'd be going out for a drink after this, but I've already started drinking on my own. But
quite hard to show it.
It censors your cigarette too. Like if you go to the side, it takes it away.
That might be for the best, but but for the artists, I can see none of them have taken me up on my offer so far. But for the artists who are still here, it's Joel Spring, Halcyon, Carolina, Alex. It would be also nice to see you, Sean, and Lauren Squire. If you come on and just have just wave at the audience to Lauren, who has been producing this whole session as the kind of Zoom ninja, running everything from her place in Melbourne.
Don't say ZJ.
Thanks so much to everyone. Thanks to Unsound, Liquid Architecture teams. I've mentioned the chats, the Discord where you can ask questions. Tomorrow's session is the third and final session of the machine listening curriculum. It's called Listening with the Pandemic. It's got an amazing lineup of artists and writers and scholars. Sean Dockray will be presenting a new work. Mark Andreevich, Tao Fan, Vladan Jola, Andrew Brooks, Shannon Matten, and also Yeshi Milner from the incredible organisation Data for Black Lives will be joining us. That just leaves one final task, which is to introduce the final performance for tonight, which is by DeForest Brown Jr. It's a performance that he's called The Tragedy of Black Citizenship. It's a collaboration with Ting Ding, who's on the camera, I believe, doing the camera work. And DeForest is in a hotel room. It's early in the morning, and we've been waiting to find out what this is going to be, but been looking forward to it all week. So once again, thanks everyone, and DeForest, if you'd like to
one last thing. DeForest is going to be playing again as part of Unsound with James Hoff at the end of the festival. I'll throw a link into the chat window, but otherwise, along with a biography. But otherwise, take it away, DeForest. Thanks everyone.